Picture this. It's midnight in a Cherokee village. Families are asleep in their cabins, children breathing softly, elders resting after long days of farming. Suddenly there's a pounding on the door. Soldiers, armed, unrelenting, burst inside. They order the family to leave. No explanation, no negotiation. Just leave, and leave everything behind. The fields they planted, the homes they built, even the graves of their ancestors. Gone. This wasn't a raid. It wasn't a war. It was policy. Government policy. Voted on in Congress. Signed into law by the President of the United States. And it was called the Indian Removal Act. The year was 1830. America, still young, still fragile, already believed it was destined to expand from ocean to ocean. But destiny, when mixed with greed, becomes something poisonous. Something dangerous. Something stupid. The Indian Removal Act wasn't just a policy, it was a betrayal. A betrayal of allies. A betrayal of America's founding ideals. And ultimately, a betrayal of America itself. Tonight, we descend into the shadows of early America. A story of progress cloaked in blood, of liberty turned into hypocrisy, and of decisions so short-sighted they would haunt a nation for generations. 3 chapters. One truth. The Indian Removal Act was one of the most dangerous and foolish ideas in American history. Chapter 1. The Mask of Progress. America in the early 1800s was a nation addicted to growth. States multiplied. Towns sprang from forests. Railroads began to snake across the land. But underneath the banners of liberty and prosperity lay something primal. Hunger. Hunger for land. Hunger for wealth. Hunger for power. The cotton gin had changed everything. Cotton was king. The South was an empire in the making. But cotton devoured land, rich, fertile land. Land already inhabited by sovereign native nations. To white settlers, this land wasn't home to thriving cultures. It was soil. Soil for cotton. Soil for slavery. Soil for profit. And in their way stood nations that had lived there for centuries. Nations that refused to disappear quietly. Enter Andrew Jackson, hero of the Battle of New Orleans. A man who built his fame on war, particularly wars against native peoples. Jackson was the embodiment of the frontier spirit, violent, ruthless, and relentless. To his supporters, he was the man of the people. To native nations, he was the man of their destruction. Jackson believed native peoples could not coexist with white settlers. To him, removal wasn't just policy, it was destiny. He promised land and opportunity to poor white farmers, painting himself as their champion. But his definition of the people excluded anyone not white, not European, not useful to his vision. Jackson's rise to the presidency in 1828 was built on a dark promise. If elected, he would open new lands for settlement. Lands that didn't belong to him. Lands that weren't his to give. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, the so-called 5 civilized tribes, had worked tirelessly to adapt. They built schools, adopted farming, printed newspapers, even drafted constitutions. They believed, naively, that assimilation would protect them. That if they could show America they were civilized, America would respect their sovereignty. But civilization was never the issue. The issue was land. And the settlers wanted it all. Georgia, impatient for Cherokee land, began passing state laws that stripped the Cherokee of rights and sovereignty. They seized land, nullified Cherokee law, and treated treaties as worthless paper. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee in Worcester versus Georgia, affirming their sovereignty. But Jackson reportedly sneered, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." In that moment, the mask slipped. Law meant nothing. Treaties meant nothing. Sovereignty meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was greed. In 1830, Jackson pushed his Indian Removal Act through Congress. It was marketed as humane. A peaceful relocation. The government would give native nations new lands west of the Mississippi, where, supposedly, they could live undisturbed. Politicians spoke of benevolence, of fairness, of destiny. But behind their polished words lay a brutal truth. This was not an invitation. It was an ultimatum. Leave your home or face annihilation. Some resisted in Congress. Davy Crockett, a frontiersman idolized by many, declared the act unjust and dishonorable. But his protest was drowned in the flood of expansionist greed. The act passed by just a few votes. With one law, Jackson had given the green light to uproot entire nations, to rip families from their homes, to march men, women, and children into the unknown. The settlers cheered, the speculators plotted, and Native America braced for the storm. The betrayal was deeper than most Americans realize. Many of these tribes had fought alongside the United States. The Cherokee had allied with Washington. The Creek had bled beside American soldiers. And yet loyalty meant nothing. Imagine fighting for a nation, only to have that same nation declare you unworthy of existing on your own land. That was the reality of the Indian Removal Act. Betrayal written into law. The text of the act was clean, orderly. It spoke of treaties, land swaps, and fairness. But in practice it was chaos. Soldiers dragging families from their homes. Children watching their parents beaten. Elders forced to leave behind the graves of their ancestors. The mask of progress could not hide the truth forever. This was not relocation. This was not peace. It was forced removal. It was theft. It was death waiting on the horizon. The ink had barely dried on the Indian Removal Act, and yet the nightmare was only beginning. What lay ahead would not be the orderly migration Jackson promised. It would be starvation. It would be disease. It would be death stretching across thousands of miles. What followed was not removal. It was annihilation disguised as policy, and its shadow would darken America forever. Chapter 2: Trail of Shadows. The year was 1831. The ink of the Indian Removal Act had dried. The treaties signed under duress were sealed. Now came the reality. Soldiers appeared at the doors of families who had lived on the land for generations, and with cold precision they forced them to march west. These were not planned migrations. They were expulsions. The people had no time to prepare, no time to gather crops, no time to mourn. Their homes were looted, their fields stolen, their sacred spaces trampled under boots. The soldiers had their orders: clear the land whatever the cost. The Choctaw were the first to face removal in mass numbers. In the winter of 1831, thousands of Choctaw people began their march westward. They carried what little they could, walking through rain, through snow, through sickness. Government contractors, hired to provide food and supplies, pocketed money and delivered almost nothing. Children starved. Elders collapsed. Bodies were buried in shallow graves along the roadside. A Choctaw chief later called it a trail of tears and death. His words were not exaggeration. They were prophecy. The Cherokee held out longer than most, even fighting in the courts to preserve their lands. But in 1838, their resistance was crushed. Federal troops descended on their villages. Families were herded into stockades like cattle. Soldiers stood guard as mothers wept, as fathers begged for mercy, as children clung to what little they had left. And when the march west began, it was not just miles that weighed them down. It was despair. The Cherokee were forced to march nearly 1,200 miles. Disease swept through the camps. Dysentery, whooping cough, measles, pneumonia. Some estimate that 1 in 4 Cherokee people died on that journey. Think about that. An entire nation reduced by a quarter in less than a year. Not by war, not by natural disaster, but by policy, by choice. Along the trails, mothers buried infants in shallow graves, covering them with branches because there was no time to dig deeper. Elders collapsed on the roadside, their bodies left behind because soldiers refused to slow the march. Entire families were erased in silence, their names forgotten, their stories untold. This was not relocation. It was extermination through exhaustion, starvation, and neglect. Soldiers tasked with escorting the tribes often treated them with contempt. Some even profited, stealing supplies meant for the marchers, selling them back at inflated prices. Corruption festered while people died. And yet, in American newspapers, this suffering was rarely described. Instead, the press wrote of progress, of opportunity, of new lands opened for settlement. The suffering of thousands was buried under the triumph of expansion. Not all went quietly. The Seminole of Florida resisted fiercely, sparking the Seminole Wars. The Seminole refused to surrender. They fought in the swamps, ambushing U.S. soldiers, refusing to be driven like cattle. The war dragged on for years, draining resources, costing countless lives. And yet, even their defiance could not stop the machine of removal. By the end, most Seminole had been killed, captured, or forced west. The survivors scattered, clinging to the swamps of Florida like ghosts. It wasn't just the 5 civilized tribes. Smaller nations, the Potawatomi, Shawnee, Sauk, Fox, and many others, faced the same fate. Each story echoed the same pattern: forced marches, starvation, death. Each tribe had its own trail. Each trail had its own dead. And together they formed a map of grief across the American landscape. A silent atlas of suffering. This was not just a human cost. It was a cultural cost. Entire languages, songs, and traditions were weakened, broken, or erased. Lands that held centuries of memory, sacred rivers, ancient mounds, holy forests, were severed from the people who gave them meaning. Imagine tearing the roots from a tree and expecting it to grow again in barren soil. That is what the Indian Removal Act demanded. It was not just cruel. It was stupid. For in erasing these nations, America erased a chance to become something greater. To be a country built not on conquest but on coexistence. Historians estimate that more than 100,000 native people were forced from their homes during the removal era. Tens of thousands died on the marches. But numbers alone cannot capture the horror. How do you measure the worth of a child buried on the roadside? How do you count the weight of a mother's scream when she realizes her infant will not survive the night? How do you place a number on betrayal? The trail of tears was not one trail, it was many. And each one carved a scar across the land, across history, across the soul of America. But cruelty was only half the story. The true stupidity of the Indian Removal Act lay not just in the suffering it caused, but in what America destroyed: alliances, knowledge, futures that could never be recovered. And those consequences would haunt the nation for centuries to come. Because you cannot build a nation by destroying its soul. Chapter 3: The Curse of Betrayal. By the 1840s, the land east of the Mississippi was cleared. The tribes were gone. The settlers had their cotton fields. The politicians had their victories. Andrew Jackson was celebrated as a hero, his portrait hanging proudly in American halls of power. But behind the triumph, something darker lingered. The Indian Removal Act had left scars, deep, festering scars, not only on the nations it destroyed but on America itself. Scars that time would never fully heal. The United States had been founded on ideals of liberty, justice, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence spoke of equality, of rights granted not by kings, but by nature itself. And yet, in the Indian Removal Act, those ideals were betrayed. How can a nation claim to defend liberty while tearing it away from others? How can it claim justice while writing betrayal into law? The contradiction was not hidden. It was glaring. And it corroded the moral foundation of the Republic. This hypocrisy was not lost on others. Foreign nations looked on and saw the truth. America's commitment to liberty was conditional. It applied to some, not all. And within America itself, the betrayal echoed. Every broken treaty, every forced march, every grave left unmarked was a reminder: the government could not be trusted. The stain of removal spread far beyond the 1830s. It poisoned every promise made thereafter. The act was not only cruel, it was short-sighted. The tribes that were removed were not enemies. Many had been allies. The Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw had fought beside American soldiers in wars. They had knowledge of the land, diplomacy, and trade networks that could have strengthened the young republic. Instead of partnership, America chose betrayal. Instead of building bridges, it burned them. By removing native nations, the U.S. created instability. Frontier wars flared up. The Seminole resisted in costly, bloody campaigns. Resources that could have built infrastructure were drained in endless conflict. There was a paradox. In trying to secure the frontier, America destabilized it. In trying to expand its strength, it weakened its foundation. Supporters of removal promised prosperity, new land for settlers, expanding cotton, endless wealth. But this too was an illusion. The cotton boom built on stolen land fed the expansion of slavery. It deepened America's dependence on human bondage. And within a generation, that dependence would explode into civil war. Hundreds of thousands would die. The nation would nearly tear itself apart. And at its root was land. Land seized through acts like the Indian removal. What seemed like economic progress was a ticking time bomb. By fueling the spread of slavery, removal had tied America's future to blood. For native nations, the betrayal did not end in the 1830s. The government promised them security in their new lands. As long as the grass grows and the rivers run, officials swore the land would be theirs. Those promises shattered too. With each new wave of settlers, with each discovery of gold or fertile soil, the boundaries shrank again. Treaty after treaty was broken. Exile followed exile. There was no end. Trust, once broken, could never be restored. The legacy of removal became the legacy of lies. The Indian Removal Act was more than a policy, was a mirror. And what it revealed was a nation willing to sacrifice its soul for land, willing to betray its allies, willing to turn liberty into a weapon of exclusion. America gained millions of acres. But in exchange, it lost something far greater: its credibility, its moral compass, its chance to become a nation that lived by its own ideals. The consequences didn't fade with time. They echoed forward, into the struggles of native communities today, into the distrust of government, into the continued fights over sovereignty and rights. Generations later, the poverty, the displacement, the cultural wounds still bleed. The shadow of removal hangs over reservations, over broken treaties, over every courtroom battle for sovereignty. The past is not past. It is present. The Indian Removal Act was dangerous because it inflicted suffering on an unimaginable scale. But it was stupid because it achieved nothing lasting. It weakened America morally, politically, strategically. It planted seeds of conflict that would grow into war. And it left a legacy of betrayal that still poisons the nation today. Removal was not destiny. It was a choice. A cruel, foolish, short-sighted choice. History is filled with mistakes. But some mistakes are more than errors. They are warnings. The Indian Removal Act was one of them. It was a decision that dressed itself in progress but delivered only death. A decision that claimed strength but revealed weakness. And above all, it was a decision that proved a simple truth. You cannot build a nation by destroying its soul. If this story unsettled you, it should. The Indian Removal Act wasn't just a mistake of the past. It's a reminder of what happens when greed wears the mask of progress, and when power tramples justice. And if you believe history's darkest chapters must be remembered, so they are never repeated, then stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, and join me as we uncover more of the shadows history tried to bury. Because there are more untold stories, more betrayals, more lessons written in blood and silence. And together, we will bring them back into the light.